afternoon and welcome to my hometown talkies. This talkies is actually dedicated to two legends. Mehboob was a singer from Matanjeri, whose songs you are watching just now, and John Abraham. Again, he shot his last film, Amarian, most of the shot scenes here. So this theatre is actually dedicated to both Mehboob and John. Today, as part of our film programs, we have a very interesting, very important talk. We are actually celebrating 100 years of Ghatak, Ritwik Ghatak, birth centenary. So we've been having a lot of festivals and commemoration events all over India. We had a retrospective in IFFK this year, and RE Archives is also planning. Has been doing. We showed his partition trilogy 2 weeks back. So this is in continuation, and also this is also a happy occasion where we have Shamya Dasgupta with us, whose book Unmechanical was released recently. I think it is one of the most uh, comprehensive book in a sense where a lot of people, there are 50 articles looking at the work of Ritwik Ghatak, work and life and vision of Ritwik Ghatak from different angles. And this book is available here. You can get an autographed copy if anybody is interested. Uh, I don't want to talk much about Ritwik Ghatak, which we will do later, but I just would like to introduce Shamya, who is a sports journalist and also a film enthusiast. Uh, so, in this lecture, this commemoration talk on Ritwik Ghatak is an event to celebrate his book and also remember Ghatak. So, I invite Shamya Dasgupta to deliver this commemoration talk. And he will also be showing some clips, after which we can have a conversation with him. Yeah, thank you.
Very thrilled to be here. My wife and I and our friends, we come to Kochi at this time of the year anyway, so it's wonderful to be here. And obviously, with the book that CS obviously just called it my book. It isn't. It's got essays by many people, including Ritwik Ghatak, obviously published a long time back, and valuable piece in it as well. Like you mentioned, I've written books before, but this is not really my book. It's a book by many people with a common sort of cause to celebrate Ritwik Ghatak, warts and all. Not just saying what a great man and great filmmaker he was, but including all the issues that dogged him, all his problems, personal as well as professional in terms of his work and his film and his everything else. So it's that's what it is. It's a celebration, yes, of course, but it's a celebration without whitewashing him or painting him out to be this wronged, brilliant person who was just trying to, he had his problems as well, and that's what I think the book tries to bring out as well. But while talking about what made his cinema so important, not just at the time he made them 50, 60, years back, he died 50 years ago, so 50, 60, 70 years back, but are still so relevant today, are still so important today. In my mind, and I'll try to explain why it's probably more important today, to know about the filmmaker and know his films and know what he was trying to say and do. He said, no filmmaker can change the people. The people are too great. They are changing themselves. I'm only recording the great changes that are taking place. He was not really allowed to do that very much. He tried. A number of factors conveniently, you know, sort of blamed on the lack of success of his films, sort of made it seem like he was not good enough, or his films were not important enough, or his films were not relevant. But there were many other factors at play, which obviously this is before my time, before most of you, looking at you, were obviously not really around then. Maybe some of you were, but certainly not in Calcutta at the time, involved in cinema to know what was happening there at the time. But what I gather from talking to people for this book primarily is that there was almost like a concerted effort to sideline him. Why? He was part of the Communist Party of India and the Indian People's Theatre Association and fell foul of them. He didn't like the way they were going. He didn't like their cultural identity and ideology and direction. And not just him, certain other people also who were part of that group of creative theatre makers fell out with the group and they were expelled. He was expelled. And that was part of it. So the Communist Party didn't want him. He was making films about India at the time, which the Congress Party didn't like, and so on and so forth. So no one really liked him. And it seems that the film society movement of Kolkata at the time, of which all the luminaries were a part, also didn't like him. He was disruptive. He was not the sort to sort of go along with with the status quo and do what was expected of him. He wanted to do things he wanted to do, and that didn't often go down well with the rest of the people. And yeah, as it turned out, he didn't really get much of an audience or viewership, and wasted away. Of course, he continued to make films, not very frequently. There was a period in the early 60s when he made the three films that CS just mentioned, Megheta Katara, Subarnarekha, and Komal Gandhar, called his Partition Trilogy. That was a particularly productive phase, but there were just a couple of films before that. His first film, made well before Satyajit Ray's Pather Panchali, was released after his death. It was never allowed to release by the political powers. And then, right at the end, just a couple of years before his death, he made a couple more films, perhaps. And the people from Kerala would appreciate this. Perhaps his greatest contribution was, at the time at least, as a film teacher at the FTII. And John Abraham, one of two people this place is named after, was one of his great proteges. And Adur Gopalakrishnan studied under him, as did many others, not from Kerala. These two people were perhaps his most best-known students from Kerala. Pardon me if I'm wrong if there were others. But that's where he said he was at his happiest. He was never happier than when he was here for a few years. A couple of years initially in a full-time capacity as a vice principal and as teacher of film direction. And he did multiple workshops here before and after that stint as well, and worked with perhaps India, the cream of India's art filmmakers, so to say, the serious filmmakers of the 70s, and even later. In the book, if you do pick it up, I start with an essay by Safdar Hashmi. Safdar Hashmi is someone we remember every January, on the 1st of January. That's when he was murdered near Delhi, supposedly by Congress goons. He writes on Ritwik Ghatak, and the two of them are so similar, and it's so fascinating that Safdar Hashmi, who died young himself, killed young, murdered when he was very young, wrote this wonderful piece on Ritwik Ghatak that I stumbled upon when I was working on the book, asked for permission, got it, printed it. I'll just read this out because it'll sort of, what I just said, it'll help you sort of understand it a little more. This is just a bit of it. The story of the physical suppression of his work is too long and painful to be recited here. Much more alarming and dangerous is the reaction of the cinema columnists, gloriously called reviewers, to present Ritwik Ghatak as a supreme structuralist and as an enigmatic and contradictory personality. Such views are clearly designed to distort Ritwik's work and its significance. The critic's effort has been to look at his work merely in terms of its contribution to the grammar of cinema, and from there to proceed to disentangle, so to say, the brilliant flashes of a superb craftsman from the more expendable morass of his regimentalized content. An equally sinister school of criticism, which operates via a liberal stance, strives to establish that Ritwik's sensitivity as a filmmaker lifted his content out of the constricting pale of regimentalized thought, which his intellectual commitment forced him to adopt. The second view was reflected in the long-established tendency to project Ritwik as a rebel in the Communist Party, who constantly fought the stranglehold of ideologists and theorists of anarchic personal behavior. Of Ritwik is seen as a measure of the protest against the discipline allegedly sought to be imposed upon creative artists by the leaders of the Indian People's Theatre Association, and at his refusal to be bound down by unnatural control of the artist's personality. What such critics fail to understand or refuse to admit is that a lifetime of hounding and mental torture born out of uncertainties and intense privations at the hands of those who regulate the film market, as well as those who man the official bodies ostensibly promoting and patronizing new cinema, drove this extremely sensitive individual, poet, scholar, and artist to a kind of self-imposed exile from the art world controlled by the commercial monster. An exile that broke him mentally and physically on several occasions. What these critics also fail to understand or admit is that, in spite of such overbearing torture, Ritwik rose again and again to create films that have become rallying points for those of us who are battling decaying culture in the 70s and in the 80s. This was, of course, written in the 80s. Far from being a rebel protesting against constraints within the cultural movement, Ritwik, unlike many erstwhile luminaries of the progressive cultural movement, never wavered in his pursuit of a medium and a message that is true to the people and carries on their struggles in the artistic sphere. He never placed his art at the disposal of commercial cinema or fell prey to the attractions of glamour and riches. In his films, he used no populist elements, the shortcuts to popularity resorted to by so many of our so-called radical filmmakers of those days. That sounds a lot like John Abraham, doesn't it? Later. But that sort of sums up by a person who loved Ritwik and was present at the time. I believe he was quite close to Ritwik's son and met Ritwik's wife a couple of times as well, Safdar. And this is a very affectionate take. But from the other conversations I've had, seems like a very, very true take on how things were at the time. Now, we're going to talk about many things today. I suppose I'm going to talk first, and then perhaps CS and I will have a conversation as well. But the thing I want to talk about is very close to my heart. It's why I said his films are perhaps more relevant today than they used to be 50, 60, 70 years back. And for that, it's a longish clip, but it's from Komal Gandhar, the third film of his Partition trilogy, though I think it released second because Shubhana Rekha, the second release later, was stuck with the censors for a variety of reasons. We'll watch this clip. We'll play clip one and maybe dim the lights so people can watch it. And it's a bit long, but yeah. Yeah, so it was a longish clip, but I'm sure all of you liked watching it. The reason I played it, I've got a couple more clips to share later, is that this really sums up a lot of what Ritwik Ghatak was about. You know, the obvious things, the river, home, these two, the very dramatized acting, which he was often accused of, melodrama, using a lot of melodrama, which was not very common in the alternate film space at the time. I think of Ritwik Ghatak as perhaps India's first independent filmmaker, something we see so much of and know so much of nowadays. He was perhaps India's first independent filmmaker. And this was not the kind of acting that was very common there. I can't say I love it all the time, but it's something he believed and had very good reason for using, because he drew so much from the myths and legends and Upanishads and Puranas of Indian literature that he felt it helped him get his actors to express themselves as accurately as he wanted. Anyway, so those are the river and the home aspects are really what I want to talk about a little more. And the fact that there's so much music, almost 3 separate songs, snatches of 3 separate songs in what is just maybe a 5-minute sequence before they start having their conversation. And those are important things when it comes to Ritwik cinema. People call him a partition, documentarian, a filmmaker of partition stories. Yes, he was. That's something that affected not just him, but everyone, perhaps in Bengal certainly, also Punjab, perhaps Kerala, fortunately, among other places, were not so directly affected by it at the time. But it certainly affected practically everyone in Bengal in some way or the other. And you remember that it came immediately after the Second World War, which came with the famine, the Great Famine. I wonder why it's called the Great Famine, but the famine, and which the effects of which are perhaps apparent to people in Bengal even today. The Great Famine that accompanied the World War, the Second World War, followed by partition, which was followed by the riots, more riots, more riots, more riots. They're continuing till today in some form or the other. It was a region torn apart by people not really connected to the land. There were people, perhaps the British had their role to play, the Indian politicians had their role to play, various people who perhaps found a reason to tear Bengal apart, played their games, and Bengal, like Punjab, was torn apart. And Ritwik, like any sensitive person would, was affected by it. What that brought to his cinema, apart from the stories of partitioned people like the two characters you saw in Komal Gandhar, who are clearly talking about their homes on the other side, which they can't go back to, is about displacement. It's partition is the spur. It's what gave him these stories. But even before partition, and that's something I discovered while working on the book, is he was interested in stories of the migrant workers and of people, the poor, who didn't live where they were from. They had to travel to work, earn a livelihood, find a home. Is that he was already interested or curious about those lives. And partition, of course, gave him a very firm sort of thing to lean on. But his real interest, to my mind, is homelessness and rootlessness. And, you know, CS and Riaz just sent someone to take me to the Amphibian Archives other exhibition just around the corner. And that's about their wonderful exhibits, their wonderful is the wrong word, on Gaza. And what's happening in Gaza today, and closer home in the Rohingyas in India, what we saw during COVID, Syria, Afghanistan, you name it, everywhere, is the same thing, where people are being forced to leave their homes. They're being removed from their homes forcibly. They are not where they need to be. In India, they don't have an identity. Bengal is going to elections, so is Kerala, various other states soon. Bengal, they have the SIR exercise that's going on right now, which forces people who are as legal as you and I, citizens of this country, to prove their citizenship, which often they fail to do. Because it's not something you thought you needed to do when you moved in or when you were born. And the world hasn't changed from when Ritwik was making these films about homelessness and displacement and rootlessness and the search for a home, the concept of a home, if you want to go on and go deeper. And if anything, it's gotten worse, won't you agree? The world over. So that's why I say his films are so much more relevant today than perhaps they were then. Because then he was very specifically talking about Bengal. But the story of Bengal then in Ritwik's films, or his search through his films, or the stories he talked about, to my mind, are far more relevant today. And that's perhaps why his films are being talked about more today. I'd like to think that, yes, there is a centenary. Yes, I've worked on a book. CS has done a book. There are many other people who have worked on books. There's screenings across the country. There are discussions about Ritwik across the country. But I think it's happening not in isolation. It's happening because there's a need for it. There's a need for his cinema to be discussed now much more than ever before, because the world's gone absolutely crazy. It's going to get much, much worse before it gets better, if it does. And it's important to know that it's not an isolated thing. This is where we've been heading all these years. And if I were that sort of person, I'd say he was, he could see the future perhaps, but no. But it's certainly very, very relevant. I could talk about the person he was a bit more, not what he became, not the self-destructive person who died at 50 due to alcoholism and related problems, who was in hospital, in and out of hospitals, including mental hospitals, the last 5-6 years of his life, estranged from his family, much else. I could talk about it, but a lot of that is actually known, much more than Ritwik the filmmaker, because that's what people prefer talking about all this while. So there's no real point in going into it. But let's also play the second clip, sir. clip 2, if we can play it, because that is, again, that's 3 scenes from the same film, Shubharna Rekha, which is about home.